March 2025, historian Kevin Levin sat at his computer preparing materials for his annual summer teacher workshop at Arlington National Cemetery. For years, he had taken educators to visit the graves of heroes like Medgar Evers, teaching them how to connect military service to the broader struggle for civil rights. But when he clicked the link to the cemetery's educational page on African American history, he found nothing. 14 lesson plans, walking tours, and teaching modules had vanished. He refreshed the page, still empty. Then he checked the notable graves section, where visitors could learn about distinguished Black, Hispanic, and female veterans. Those pages were gone too. The nation's most sacred military cemetery was systematically erasing its Black heroes. On January the 20th, 2025, hours after his inauguration, President Donald Trump signed executive order titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. The order directed every federal agency to terminate all activities relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Within weeks, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issued his own memo to the Pentagon, declaring that diversity, equity, and inclusion was dead at the Department of Defense. On February the 26th, Chief Pentagon spokesman Shaw Parnell sent a memo to the entire department. By March 5th, every component must take all practicable steps to remove all Department of Defense news, feature articles, photos, and videos that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. The memo was explicit. Content requiring removal included anything counter to merit-based or colorblind policies, which it defined as articles that focus on immutable characteristics such as race, ethnicity, or sex. Arlington National Cemetery fell under Pentagon control. On March 12, 2025, pages began disappearing from the cemetery's website. Between December 2024 and March 2025, dozens of links vanished. The notable graves drop-down menu no longer showed African American history, Hispanic American history, or women's history. Educational themes on the Civil War disappeared. Modules on Medal of Honor recipients went dark. The page for Freedmen's Village, a settlement of formerly enslaved people that existed on Arlington's grounds from 1863 to 1900, was deleted from the main website. Individual heroes vanished one by one. General Colin Powell, the first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and later Secretary of State, was removed from the notable graves list. World War II veteran and civil rights icon Medgar Evers, whom Trump himself had called a great American hero in 2017 during a visit to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, disappeared from the website. The Tuskegee Airmen, America's first Black military pilots who flew over 1,200 combat missions in World War II, despite facing segregation and discrimination at home, were scrubbed from educational materials. The 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only predominantly Black, all-female unit sent overseas during World War II, was no longer easily accessible through the site's navigation. Army Major General Charles Calvin Rogers, awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in Vietnam on November 1, 1968, was removed. When his page was archived, someone changed the URL from Medal to Dedal, as if Rogers had received the nation's highest military honor, not for extraordinary courage under fire, but simply because of his race. Rogers had been shot 3 times during a massive enemy assault near the Cambodian border. Despite his wounds, he exposed himself repeatedly to hostile fire to organize the defense, direct artillery, and rally his troops. He was the highest-ranking Black soldier to receive the Medal of Honor. Now, visitors to his page received a 404 error message. Supreme Court Justice Thud Marshall, the first Black person to sit on the High Court and a World War I veteran, was no longer listed prominently. Ira Hayes, the Puma Indian Marine who was one of 6 men to raise the American flag at Iwo in one of the most iconic photographs from World War II, disappeared. The Navajo code talkers, whose tribal language created an unbreakable code that helped win the Pacific War, were taken down. Jackie Robinson, who broke baseball's color barrier, but also served as a 2nd lieutenant in the Army during World War II, and was court-martialed for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus, vanished from the website. Women veterans were equally affected. Beyond Arlington, according to the Associated Press, the Department of Defense marked over 26,000 images of veterans from diverse backgrounds for removal. The drag it caught absurdities. At least 6 photos of the Enola Gay, the bomber that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, were flagged for removal because the aircraft appeared in a search for files containing the word gay. The plane was named after Enola Gay Tibbets, the mother of pilot Paul Tibbets. The algorithm couldn't distinguish between a surname and sexual orientation. At Arlington itself, entire categories of historical memory were being dismantled. The Civil War educational page, which had featured lesson plans on the United States colored troops, Black American regiments that served in the Union Army, was stripped to a brief overview. The lesson plan had noted that some units faced discrimination and unequal treatment, and that all units highlighted in the series served their country admirably and made a lasting impact. That nuanced teaching of history was now gone. Friedman's Village, one of the most significant chapters in Arlington's history, was effectively hidden. Established in June 1863 on the confiscated estate of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Friedman's Village was a planned community where the federal government relocated formerly enslaved people fleeing to Washington during the Civil War. What began as a temporary refuge became a thriving settlement that lasted 37 years. At its peak, over 1,000 people lived there. The village included 50 houses curving around a central pond, schools, a hospital, churches, and training workshops where residents learned skilled trades like blacksmithing and carpentry. Schuyler Truth, the renowned abolitionist, lived in Friedman's Village for about a year in 1864, counseling residents and helping them find work. Many laborers from the village worked on construction of the Capitol building. In 1866, the Army recruited the 107th Regiment of United States colored troops from the village. The village was intentionally established on Lee's former plantation as a symbolic statement that the Confederacy's most prominent military leader land would now house the very people he had fought to keep enslaved. By 1900, rising real estate values led to the ville's closure, and the land was fully absorbed into Arlington National Cemetery. Between 3,000 to 804,000 residents of Friedman's Village are buried in Section 27, their headstones marked with the words civilian and citizen. This entire chapter of history was now buried in archived links, inaccessible to visitors trying to understand Arlington's complete story. The removal sparked immediate outrage. Civil War historian Kevin Levin, who first discovered the changes, wrote, "Like it or not, the complete history of Arlington National Cemetery and that of the military is a story of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. It is embedded in the very landscape of Arlington." Maryland Representative Jamie Raskin called it a terrible affront to the veterans posthumously dishonored and canceled, and to their families. Progressive veterans group Vote Vets accused the Trump administration of whitewashing history, stating Arlington National Cemetery just erased DEI from its website because Republicans threw a tantrum over honoring all who served. Former Mississippi Supreme Court Justice Reuben Anderson, who gave Trump a tour of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in 2017, expressed disbelief at Medgar Evers' removal. "That's got to be a mistake," he said. Medgar Evers was one of the most courageous Americans of all time. Representative Benny Thompson noted that a history has often overlooked minorities' contributions and criticized the administration for simultaneously cutting 80,000 jobs from the Department of Veterans Affairs, worsening access to medical care for veterans. Arlington National Cemetery issued a carefully worded statement. "We are proud of our educational content and programming and working diligently to return removed content to ensure alignment with Department of Defense Instruction 5400 once seen and executive orders issued by the President. We remain committed to sharing the stories of military service and sacrifice to the nation with transparency and professionalism." The statement claimed no service members had been permanently removed, noting that individuals from prior categories could be found in other categories such as prominent military figures or science, technology, and engineering based on their historical contribution to the nation. But this missed the point entirely. Removing dedicated pages for African American history, Hispanic American history, and women's history wasn't simply reorganization, it was erasure of context. When Colin Powell's story appears only under prominent longer accessible through African American history, the connection between his World War II service and his civil rights activism is severed. When the Tuskegee Airmen are scattered across different categories, The reality of what they overcame, flying combat missions while facing segregation at home, becomes invisible. The removals revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion actually means in a military context. These weren't invented categories imposed on history. They were the history. The 688th Battalion existed because the Army segregated black women into a separate unit. They weren't celebrated for diversity's sake. They were celebrated because they accomplished in 3 months what the Army estimated would take 6 while working in freezing warehouses, facing discrimination, and being denied access to Red Cross facilities. The Tuskegee Airmen existed because black men weren't allowed to serve alongside white pilots. They became legendary because they flew 1,500 missions without losing a single bomber. They escorted, a record unmatched by any other fighter group. Their story isn't about diversity, it's about excellence achieved despite discrimination. Medgar wasn't notable simply for being black. He was notable because after serving his country in World War II, landing at Normandy on D-Day, he returned to Mississippi and fought to desegregate the University of Mississippi Law School, register black voters, and investigate lynchings, knowing full well it could cost his life. On June 12, 1963, Byron de Beckwith, a white supremacist, shot Evers in the back outside his home. Evers was 37 years old. At his funeral, John F. Kennedy sent a telegram calling him a brave man whose devotion and sacrifice for his country should forever be an inspiration. Evers was buried at Arlington with full military honors. In 2017, Trump stood at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum and said, Sergeant Evers was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. In Arlington, he lies beside men and women of all races, backgrounds, and walks of life who have served and sacrificed for our country. Their headstones do not mark the color of their skin, but immortalize the courage of their deeds. That is what Medgar Evers was. He was a great American hero. 8 years later, Trump's administration removed Evers from Arlington's website. The contradiction was glaring. If headstones don't mark the color of skin, but immortalize courage, why remove educational materials that explain the specific courage it took to serve a country that didn't treat you equally? If Evers was a great American hero, why make his story harder to find? The Trump administration's logic seemed to be that acknowledging racism in American history was itself racist, that teaching about discrimination was discriminatory, that recognizing barriers overcome was creating new barriers. This was historical revisionism disguised as colorblindness. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had declared at a Pentagon town hall, "The single dumbest phrase in military history is, 'Our diversity is our strength.'" He argued that diversity, equity, and inclusion served to divide the force rather than unite it. But this ignored the military's actual history. The greatest divisions in American military history weren't caused by acknowledging diversity. They were caused by denying it. The Army was segregated until 1948. Black soldiers in World War II fought in separate units, often given inferior equipment and support roles despite proving their combat effectiveness again and again. The Navy restricted black sailors to mess attendant duties until 1942. The Marine Corps didn't accept black recruits until 1942. Women weren't allowed to serve in combat roles until the 1990s. The military's strength wasn't built on color blindness. It was built on the painful decades-long process of finally recognizing that talent exists in every community, and that barriers based on race or gender weaken the force. The irony of removing this history during March, which presidents, including Trump, had proclaimed as Women's History Month, was not lost on critics. While officially celebrating women's contributions, the administration was systematically removing information about women veterans from federal websites. The disconnect suggested that recognition of women's service was acceptable only when separated from any acknowledgement that women faced obstacles men did not. Some pages were quietly restored after public backlash. Colin Powell's page reappeared on March the 16th. Material on Jackie Robinson, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the Navajo Code Talkers came back online, but many remained missing. Medgar Evers' page stayed down. The comprehensive educational modules on African American history, Hispanic navigation, the careful curation of Arlington's complex history developed over years by historians and educators was replaced by a stripped-down version that avoided uncomfortable truths about American military history. The removals were part of a broader pattern. In February, the Air Force removed content about the Tuskegee Airmen from a basic training class, then restored it after outcry. The Pentagon ordered the removal of all content promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion from military websites and social media. In May, Secretary Hegseth ordered military libraries to review and pull all books related to diversity, anti-racism, and gender issues by May 21st. The directive characterized such materials as promoting divisive concepts and gender ideology incompatible with the Department of Defense's core mission. The effect was chilling. Educators preparing lessons on military history now had to work around gaps in official sources. Teachers who had used Arlington's educational modules to connect military service to broader American history found their materials gone. Veterans groups representing minority service members watched as their contributions were minimized or hidden. According to the latest Defense Department report, 30% of the military's 2 million active duty and reserve personnel identify as part of a minority group, and 1/5 of service members are women. The message to those service members was clear: your contributions are politically controversial. Your service will be acknowledged only if it can be discussed without mentioning the barriers you overcame. This wasn't the first time American military history had been sanitized. After the Civil War, Northern and Southern white Americans reached an unofficial agreement to minimize slavery's role in causing the conflict and to downplay the contributions of black soldiers who fought for the Union. This lost cause narrative dominated American history textbooks for generations. It erased the service of 180,000 black soldiers in the Union Army, including the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment and the United States Colored Troops recruited from Freedmen's Village. It minimized the reality that the Confederacy was founded explicitly to preserve slavery. The result was a distorted understanding of American history that persisted for over a century. Historian Webb Dubois wrote in Black Reconstruction in America that white scholars had deliberately falsified history to create a narrative that offered a false but comforting sense of accomplishment. The Trump administration's removals echoed that pattern by erasing context about discrimination. The narrative becomes simpler, more comfortable. The Tuskegee Airmen are just excellent pilots. Medgar Evers is just a civil rights leader. Colin Powell is just a successful general. But removing the context of what they overcame doesn't honor them. It diminishes them. Their accomplishments were remarkable precisely because they achieved them while fighting two enemies: the nation's foreign adversaries and the nation's domestic prejudices. Arlington National Cemetery is more than a burial ground. It's a national memory palace where the physical landscape tells the story of who America honors and why. Section 27, where Freedmen's Village residents are buried, tells the story of people who escaped slavery and built new lives in freedom. Section 60, where recent war casualties are buried, tells the story of modern conflicts. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier tells the story of service that cannot be individually named, but must be collectively honored. The graves of the Tuskegee Airmen tell the story of proving excellence in the face of doubt. When Arlington's educational materials contextualize these stories, they transform the cemetery from a collection of individual graves into a cohesive narrative of American sacrifice and progress. Removing that context doesn't make Arlington colorblind. It makes it incomplete. Visitors walking through Section 27 will see headstones marked civilian and citizen without understanding that these are residents of Freedmen's Village, that this corner of Arlington was once a thriving community of formerly enslaved people learning to live in freedom on the former plantation of Robert E. Lee. Visitors seeing the graves of Tuskegee Airmen won't understand why these pilots flew in a separate unit, won't know about the struggles they faced proving themselves worthy of flying, compliance with executive orders, and will be republished when appropriate, but appropriate by whose standards? If acknowledging that the 61,088 faced discrimination while serving their country is considered promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, then accurate history itself has become politically controversial. The question isn't whether Arlington should honor Black veterans, Hispanic veterans, or women veterans. It does and will continue to do so. The question is whether their stories can be told completely with context and honesty, or whether they must be sanitized to avoid mentioning the obstacles they faced. Can we honor the Tuskegee Airmen without acknowledging segregation? Can we honor Medgar Evers without discussing his civil rights work? Can we honor the 688 without noting they were the only all-black female unit sent overseas? The Trump administration's answer appears to be yes. We must honor their service while minimizing the discrimination they overcame. This is the second time in recent months that Trump's actions have affected how black military service is remembered and honored. The Arlington removals follow his administration's broader assault on how American military history is taught and commemorated. Each erasure is individually defensible as compliance with executive orders. Collectively, they represent a systematic effort to present American military history without the complications of racism, discrimination, or the long struggle to make the promise of equal treatment real. The veterans buried at Arlington National Cemetery served a nation that didn't always serve them back. They wore the uniform despite facing discrimination. They fought for democracy abroad while being denied full democracy at home. They proved their excellence despite systems designed to limit their opportunities. Their service was remarkable not despite these obstacles, but because of them. Removing that context from Arlington's educational materials doesn't honor them. It distorts their legacy. When Trump called Medgar Evers a great American hero in 2017, he was right. Evers' heroism came from his military service and his civil rights activism, two aspects of the same fight for America to live up to its ideals. When the Trump administration removed Evers from Arlington's website in 2025, they severed that connection. What remains is a name on a headstone divorced from the full story of why he matters. Arlington National Cemetery is where America remembers its military dead, but memory requires more than names and dates. It requires understanding. When Arlington's website offered comprehensive educational materials on African American history, Hispanic American history, and women's history, it was doing what national cemeteries should do, helping visitors understand not just who was buried there, but why their service mattered, what obstacles they overcame, and how their sacrifice shaped the nation. When those materials were removed, Arlington became less a memory palace and more a curated forgetting. The stories of Colin Powell, Medgar Evers, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 6th TAN's 8th Battalion, and thousands of other Black, Hispanic, and female veterans aren't divisive. They're American. They're part of the complete, complicated, often painful history of how the United States military became the diverse professional force it is today. Erasing those stories doesn't unite the force. It dishonors those who served and sacrifices honest history on the altar of political convenience. The veterans buried at Arlington deserve better. America deserves the truth.